Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Dmitry, and from this video you will learn how to start with template-driven forms in Angular. But not just how to start. This is something you can read in official Angular documentation. I'm going to show you also what is going on under the hood when you import FormsModule. This video is just a tiny part of my new upcoming video course dedicated to Angular Forms, where you will find more than 7 hours of in-depth videos dedicated to template-driven forms, reactive forms, and also in the end of the full version of this course, you will be able to build your completely custom form controls like this funny rating picker or this cool drop-down select component that allows user to pick some option, and also it will support the multi-selection and navigation and option selection using your keyboard. Officially, the full version of this course will be available from November 11, 2022, so basically in the end of this week. And if you're watching until this date, you have a chance to get the full version of this course for free. How to do that, you will learn in the end of this video. But for now, enjoy this video and I hope you will learn something interesting. Before we dive into the course and start learning Angular forms and their different variations like template-driven or reactive forms, I would like to talk with you about building blocks that are essential and common for both of them. I find this lesson very important because we will be dealing with that building blocks directly or indirectly every time, and it doesn't matter which type of forms we use. So, let's have a look at some native form control like text input. What we can say about it? Which hypothetical properties could it have? Well, we can say that the form control can have some value, right? It can be valid or invalid, or it might be enabled or disabled. So in short, we can say that the input has some state. Obviously, we can change the state by setting the new value, we can enable or disable the control, and so on. To represent the control state, Angular uses a special abstraction that you must probably know and use, and it is called form control. This is just a simple JavaScript class whose responsibility is to hold the state, for instance, value, validation status, etc. Its responsibility also to provide methods for the state updating, and it should run validators when the value of the form control instance changes. By the way, because it is just a simple JavaScript class, you can even import and instantiate this class without importing any Angular Forms module. Sure, by itself it is quite useless, but you can actually do it if you want. So why do we need this abstraction? Well, because the state of control should not depend on the concrete implementation of the control. We should not directly access the input. When we want to read the value of the control, we want to get a value, and we don't care if it is a text input or if it is a native select element or if it is some custom component. And here you might think like, alright, you say that form control knows nothing about text inputs and other types of controls, but how the form control synchronizes the value between native control and its own state? Well, form control doesn't work alone. It works in tandem with ValueAccessor. It is another class that knows how to work with concrete native control API, and its responsibility to perform a state synchronization between the native control, like text input, and the corresponding form control instance. Because there are many different native controls like text input, select, and so on, there are also many different value accessors, which we'll learn in detail in the full version of this course. But we are already slightly out of track, so let's get back to the form controls. Form controls can exist standalone, but if we think about some random form, we will see that it is actually a group of different form controls, right? So form controls can be grouped, and there is a dedicated model which describes this use case, and it is called form group. Groups can be nested, so it means the group can contain another group and so on, and usually the root group is representing the final form. The main responsibility of form group model is the aggregating state of form controls that belongs to this group. For instance, the value of the form group is an object that aggregates all values of the form controls it contains. The combination of form group and form control models is something you will be dealing with in 80% of cases. Less often you may encounter the model form array that is doing also grouping, but it groups form controls in the array, unlike the form group model that groups everything into the object. And if you are very experienced with Angular forms, you can mention also the brand new form record model, but from the functional point of view, it is the same as form group. The only difference between them is that form record brings some simplified typing definitions if you have to deal with the form group where you have to dynamically add or remove form controls. That's it. So basically we have the following models available in Angular Forms. It is a form control, it is a form group, form record, and form array. What is also worth mentioning is that all those four classes directly or indirectly extend the common abstract class that is called abstract control. And that's why all models have a lot of common in their public API, but obviously different implementations, of course. So if you see in the code that some function or validator expects as an argument abstract control, it means that you can provide any of that four classes and it will just work. In this video, I will start showing you how to start with template-driven Angular forms and explain to you what is happening under the hood when we import an appropriate Angular module. So let me open a component where we will be mostly working. It is called template forms page. As you can see, the component is almost empty, but if we jump to the components template, you can see that we have some HTML form. Nothing special actually here. This form has no Angular directives, components, handlers, or anything else. Just a pure HTML5 form. And this is how it looks in a browser. Pay attention that when I click the Save button, the page is being reloaded, which is actually the default behavior. Well, in order to start with template-driven forms in Angular, we have to import an appropriate module for that. If you build your application with ngModels, you can import the FormsModule into the module where you are going to use its features. But if you use standalone components as I do in this course, then you need to add the module to the imports array for the component. FormsModule is responsible exclusively for template-driven forms, and once I import FormsModule, I activate this kind of Angular form in this component, or module if you use them. And now if I save this change and go to the browser, you will not see any visual changes. However, if you try to click the Save button one more time, you can see that the page isn't being reloaded anymore. So it turns out that some magic happened once we imported the Forms module. But what happened exactly? Actually, this module exports some set of Angular directives, and some of them were automatically attached to our form. Now let me quickly prove my statement. In the browser console, I'm going to use an Angular utility that is available when you run your application in development mode. And this ngObject provides a set of helper functions that you can use. And in my case, I need getDirectives method, which as an argument expects a reference to the HTML element which you are going to inspect. In our case, it is a form, so you can either use methods from the document object like getElementByTagName and then get the reference to the form this way, or you can use an element picker tool, and once you pick the element, the reference to this selected element will be available in a special variable in the console called $0. So now if I run this code, you can see that 3 directives reside on this node, namely ngNoValidate, ngControlStatusGroup, and ngForm. It happened because of imported FormsModule, so if I remove it from imports and run the same command again, you can see that there are no directives anymore and the array is empty. So let me quickly revert this stuff. But how those directives were automatically applied? Shouldn't we add them manually in the template like that? Well, what I have done now is so-called attribute selector for a directive, but the truth is that the selector for the directive can be also the tag name or CSS selector, and in this case the directive might be applied kind of automatically. And this is exactly what happened in our scenario. Here you can see a source code of the ngForm directive, one of the directives that were applied to our form. You can see this long selector that contains actually 3 selectors separated by a comma. The last 2 have no impact on our particular use case, but the first one is exactly the reason why the directive was automatically applied. Because look, it says, attach the directive to the HTML tag form that has neither ngNoForm attribute nor form group, which makes our form tag a valid selector. From it, we can also make a conclusion that if you want to make Angular ignore some particular form, you can just add an attribute ngNoForm to the form tag, and then that set of Angular form directives will not be applied, so the form will be kind of ignored. Obviously, it is not what I need, so I will revert it. Let's get back to the ngForm directive source code again. You can also see that the directive handles some native JavaScript events like submit and reset for the host element. By the way, this notation is equivalent to the host binding decorator that is most probably more familiar to you. Here below you can see outputs, and again it is an equivalent notation to the normal component output decorator. So now when the submit event happens for the form, this directive reacts and handles it by doing some control synchronization, emitting ngSubmit output, passing the native event as a value, and then it returns false. That actually prevents page reloading. But yeah, all these implementation details are very interesting, but we should get back to the topic. While we are inside the Angular source code, I would suggest you also quickly have a look at the FormsModule itself. Here you can see FormsModule and Reactive Forms module that we will cover in the separate section. So let's focus on the first one. If you are an experienced Angular developer, then nothing should surprise you. It is just a regular ngModule that declares a set of directives assigned to the constant template-driven directives, and namely ngModel, ngModel group, and ngForm directives are declared. All of them we will cover in this section. If we go back, you can see also the internal forms shared module, which exports a set of shared form directives. Those directives are common for reactive and template-driven forms. Some of them we will use in this course, and some of them are being used internally, like ngControl status group. By the way, if you remember, this directive was also the one that was attached to our form automatically. So now let's quickly recap what we have learned so far. In order to start using template-driven forms, we must import FormsModule. This module exports some set of Angular directives that are automatically applied to the form tag on the page because those directives are using the tag name selector. To investigate what directives resides on the HTML element, we can use the getDirectives method from the global ng object. Both reactive and template-driven forms have a set of shared directives, but of course there are directives that belong specifically to some certain form type. I hope I was able to explain it clearly enough and you have a better understanding of what is going on under the hood. Forms are the way users interact with data, and I think you agree with me that without data, forms are kind of useless. So let's create some pieces of data for this section. Somewhere under the core folder, I create a new TypeScript file called userinfo, and this file will export some interface that describes the user information. Namely, we have to define all the fields that are available in our form. So I will add the first name field, which has a type string, same for the last name, and so on and so forth. Now we would need to create an object that implements this interface. So I will go to my component file and make a new property with the type userinfo. TypeScript definitely complains because required properties are missing, so let's implement them. Cool. Now we would need to somehow bind this form model with the actual form in the component template. In template-driven forms, the binding happens by using the ngModel directive. We will learn more about this directive later, but for now, just treat this directive as a bridge between our form model and the native control, which is like input in our case. However, it is still not enough information for Angular on how to bind an appropriate form control with the corresponding field in the form data object. So we have to define it somehow explicitly, but how? If we look up the source code of ngModel, you can see that there exists an input called ngModel as well, and it does track a value that is bound to this directive. Exactly what we need actually. So, according to that, we can use the ngModel property to provide the value that needs to be bound to this particular control. In such a way, we have connected the form control with the corresponding field in the form data model. This notation also can be shortened because when the directive property and selector have the same name, then you can leave only data binding and the result will be the same because such a way you declare the Angular directive on some HTML tag and at the same time you provide the value for the directive property. However, it would be still not enough to make it work, because if we open the browser console, you can see a runtime error, and namely it says that we use ngModel within a form tag. So that's why we should also provide a name attribute, or we should define this control as a standalone. About standalone controls, we will talk later in this course. So let's fix it by adding the name attribute to our control. So I go back to the template and add the name attribute with the value first name. Cool. Now the form group that is created for the form tag can properly work and track this control because it has a unique key. And also you can notice that error inside the browser console has disappeared. Now let's get back and make sure that our binding is actually working. So I will change the value in the form model to some string, and we can see that the value was synchronized with our form control, which is cool. But the data can be changed also by the user, so another way around. And currently we have a problem with that. Let me quickly demonstrate it. Somewhere here above I will create a paragraph, and here below I will print my form model data, and I apply the JSON pipe for some nice formatting, and this is how it looks now in the browser. You may notice that when I change my first name, this change isn't reflected in the form model, though it should be. It happens because currently we have one-way data binding and our data flows from the form model to the view, and our input is a part of this view. That's why our changes in the input that basically happens on the view side, they're not synchronized because we don't currently have any mechanism which would implement two-way data binding and synchronize the value from the view to the model. To make the two-way data binding work for the ngModel, you should use a construction called banana in the box. And in such a way, the data will be synchronized from the data model to the view and vice versa. Now you can see when I type in the first name field, the changes are also propagated to the form model. I will not be explaining in detail two-way data binding in Angular, and just mention that it is not something ngModel specific. And if you would like to know more about it, you can have a look at the video edition number 2 for this course. But yeah, let's continue, and obviously we should bind the rest of the properties with corresponding controls. Likewise, we did it for the first name. So I will copy this part and apply it also for the last name, of course with some small adjustments. And in order to save your time, I will pause the video and get back when I update all controls. So, welcome back. I just updated all my controls, and now we can go to the browser and see that everything works fine. You can see I'm changing the field last name and the value is being synchronized perfectly with the form model. The same works also for the nickname. Email control works as well. So everything works just as we expected. Now it is time to recap what we have learned so far. To bind the form data with the HTML form using template-driven forms, you have to use the ngModel directive that works like a bridge between the native form control and your form data. It helps to track and synchronize value changes and react to the control's state. To achieve a two-way data binding for the control and associated data, you have to use the banana in the box syntax. And also, do not forget to add attribute name to your controls, because it is required for the proper work of the ngForm directive. So we have already learned two Angular directives, ngForm and ngModel. We know what they are responsible for, and now it is time to dive deeper and explore what happens under the hood and how those two directives relate to each other. This video is not mandatory, and you can safely skip it if you like. This video is for those who really like to know a little bit more about the internal implementation of Angular features, but it is not mandatory for the further videos in the course. So let's get started from ngModel. I'm going to pick the first input as a test subject, and using the already familiar getDirectives method, I get the list of all directives that reside on this node. So you can see three directives. The first two ones I'm going to skip because we will cover them in separate videos, and let's focus on the ngModel. Here you can see properties that should be already familiar to you. The model property that keeps basically the value of the form control, and here you can see the name property, and it is exactly what we defined for every form control as a name property in the component template. Also, besides those two, there are a couple of other properties I would like to highlight here. The first one is the control property, whose value is an instance of some form control class. The form control class is one of the 4 building blocks in Angular Forms, and it is responsible for tracking the value and validation status for every single form control. Basically, it represents a state of the form control, right? We will learn more about form control in the section about reactive forms, because in reactive forms we work with these form building blocks directly, while in template-driven forms they are kind of encapsulated by the directives like ngModel, but it allows us to build forms declarative way. So far, just treat the form control as a representation of the form control state, and it is a single source of truth for the ngModel directive. You can see here some properties of the ngModel class like value, valid, or invalid. They all are getters that read the corresponding value from this form control. That's it. The following property I would like to mention is form directive, and it contains the reference to the ngForm where this ngModel directive has been declared. It needs this reference because ngModel is also responsible for registering its form control instance inside the ngForm directive, and ngForm is a kind of aggregator of all form controls declared within the form. The form control registration happens inside the ngOnChanges lifecycle hook of ngModel. It happens by calling setUpControl method that eventually calls addControl method, and there happens already the registration of the control in the ngForm using the name we provided as a key and the form control instance as a value. So if we get back to the ngForm directive instance, we will see the following picture. The ngForm has the property called form, and this is an instance of form group. The form group is another building block of the Angular forms that we will cover more in the section about reactive forms. But basically, the responsibility of this class is quite similar to form control ones. It is tracking the value and validation status, but this time for the collection of form controls. And for instance, if at least one form controls within the group becomes invalid, then the whole form group becomes invalid. And the same is applicable for other form control states. So this form property contains all our form controls registered by ngModel directives in our form. Here you can see the object where the key is a name we provided for ngModel and the value is the corresponding form control instance, and this is the reason why that name property is required. Because the form group and form control extend the same abstract control, they have many common properties, and one of them is value. But unlike the form control that stores one single value, the form group has an object that contains values of all form controls and nested groups. Yeah, we can have nested form groups, but we will learn it a little bit later in this course. But so far, let's recap what we have learned. Apart from all, the ngModel directive is also a container and owner of the form control instance that is the smallest building block of Angular Forms. The form control is responsible for the value tracking and validation state of an individual form control like input, select, etc. Additionally, ngModel has a reference to the parent ngForm directive that is basically a container for the form group instance, which is grouping multiple form control instances and tracks value and validation status for the whole group of controls. So the value for the form group will be an aggregation of all form controls within this group. If we have a look one more time at the ngModel source code or documentation of this directive, we can discover that it has an input called ngModel options, where we can pass some config. Here you can see three options: name, standalone, and update on property. I go back to my template and let's create an appropriate property binding for the ngModel options input, where we will provide a config object. And let me quickly format it like that, so it will be more readable for you. I would suggest you get started from the name option. The name is nothing else as a name we defined here, and it is basically just an alternative way to provide it. So instead of using the input, I could provide it with the config object like that. If we save and reload the page, you can see that there are no errors and everything works. Now let's get back and talk about the update on option. Currently, ngModel modifies the model value every time we type something, and it might be too frequent in some cases. For instance, the validators are being triggered every time the form control value changes, and we might have a very expensive validator that we don't want to run so frequently, because otherwise we might run into performance issues. And ngModel allows us to configure this strategy and explicitly tell form control on which event the value should be updated. There are three available values for that: change, blur, and submit. By default, the change event is being used, so we saw it already in action. Now let's try to use the blur strategy. And now you can see that the form control updates the value only when we move the focus away from this particular control, in such a way triggering a blur JavaScript event. And this is actually a widely used strategy, and you can see it in many applications. Also, you can instruct form control to update the value when the form is submitted. So now the first name will change only when I press the save button, triggering the submit event for the form. And you may ask, if I have dozens of ngModels in my form and I want all of them to be updated on the blur event, should I configure each model separately? And it is a reasonable question, and the solution for that is using a property ngForm options that is available for the ngForm directive. The config for ngForm options has only the update on option that might also have three possible values. They are the same: change, blur, and submit. And if you define the update strategy here to blur, for instance, then all form controls in this form will inherit this strategy. You can see now all of them change the value only on the blur event. Of course, this global strategy might be overridden for the single ngModel by explicitly configuring the update on property in its config object. So let's say if I replace here again with change, then the first name will be updated every time I type something into the input, but other form controls will be updated only when the blur event has been triggered. So this is how the update on strategy works. The last option available for ngModel config is standalone, but about that we will talk in the next chapter, so see you there. In the previous chapter, I mentioned that ngModel can be standalone, so let's talk about it in more detail. When the ngModel is standalone, it means that it will not register itself in the parent ngForm. For instance, if I make it standalone and then go to the browser and inspect the list of controls in the ngForm directive, you will not see the first name control because it is standalone and it doesn't belong to this form anymore. Also, if you have a look at the value of the form, you can see that the first name key was obviously excluded as well. When it could be useful? Well, there might be a couple of scenarios when you would like to exclude some form control from the form. It can be some so-called helper input which might be needed for proper work of the form, but we are not interested in its value. For instance, you might have some autocomplete where you are interested in the selected value from the autocomplete rather than the input value itself. We could have a case where we don't want to save the user's year of birth, but we use this select in order to detect the user's age and show some additional form fields depending on the user's age. Something like that, you know? So this is the first scenario. The second case is when you need just a single form control in your component. It might be some global search field somewhere in the header, or maybe there could be some drop down to pick the website language, things like that. Because creating a form for that kind of control is quite obsolete. So it is the perfect use case for the standalone form control. And because later in this course we would need some standalone input like global search, so I would suggest you implement one in the header component. So I go to the header component and somewhere here after links, I add the input with the class global search and placeholder global search as well. Then I'm going to apply the ngModel directive and I define some search string for it. We could add an ngModel options property and define that it is going to be a standalone model, but if you use ngModel outside of the form, then it will be configured as a standalone by default. You should do it explicitly only if it is a part of the form. So in my case, I can remove it. Then I go to TS file and create a property search string that is an empty string by default. And because we use ngModel in this component, I should also import the FormsModule. Let's quickly check how it looks like. All right. It could be better. First of all, we should restrict the width for the input, and I think it would be nicer if we had a logo and input pushed to the edges and navigation would be in the middle. So then I would go and wrap navigation links with some div with the nav class, and then in my styles I will add style for the global search field and restrict the width. For the navigation links container, I apply display flags property, and for header, I should apply justify content with a value space between to push logo and the search field to the edges and navigation take a center between them. And the last but not least, we should remove standalone property from our form like that. Now let's check our application and it looks definitely better. All right, let's quickly recap what we just learned. In standalone mode, ngModel doesn't register itself in the parent form, so the control will not be available in the form and form value. In order to configure the ngModel as standalone, you have to provide an option standalone set to true, but if you use ngModel outside of the form, then standalone mode will be picked automatically. Standalone form controls might be useful when you need some control to make the form properly work, but you don't want this control to be a part of the form control group, or if you need just one single control like a global search we just created. Alright, we have already learned quite a lot about template-driven forms. We know what Angular directives are responsible for this kind of form, how they relate to each other, which options are available to configure those directives, and of course, we can bind our component data to the actual form and synchronize its values. In real application, the interaction with the form almost always ends up with the form submission, and this is exactly what we will talk about in this lesson. So, as you may remember, the ngForm directive listens for the native event submit in our form, then it handles it and emits an event on submit via event emitter. And this is the event we are going to listen in our form. So I go to the form and add a new listener for this event and create some handler function that will be executed once this event is triggered. And let's create this handler in our component TS file. And let this handler just console log some string for now. If we save this change and go to the browser, we can see that once I press the save button, the submit event is triggered and my callback prints the string in the console. But we submit forms not to print out strings in the console, right? We usually want to access the form values and dispatch them to the server or handle it some other way. We cannot rely on the user info property because the form model should not necessarily be an object like we have now, and ngModel doesn't care about its structure. You could extract the first name, for instance, to separate property and provide it as a value to the corresponding ngModel, and it will work fine. And for the rest of the values, there could be the same story, and it would be very, very inconvenient to deal with multiple sources. But we remember that ngForm has a form group that basically contains all the form controls registered in this form and its values. So we would need to get a reference to the ngForm and read the value from there. The best way to do it is to assign the instance of ngForm directive to the template variable, like that. And now we can pass it as an argument for our callback. By the way, if this everything looks like magic to you, then have a look at the video edition number 2 for this course. There I explained in detail how it works. But we continue and let's adjust the handler and define the ngForm here as the first argument. Now we can read the form values from the form like that. So now we can go to the browser, change some fields, and now you can see that the form value was printed out, and now you can do whatever you want with that data. If you remember, the ngForm directive propagates the native submit event as well, and if for whatever reason you need it, you can easily get access to it via $event and provide it as a second argument for the handler. So you would be able to read it here and do whatever you want with this event. Usually you don't need it, but let it stay here as a reminder for you that it is possible. Of course, you would like to reset the form after you submitted it. About form resetting, let's talk later in this course, because a reset is not about values resetting only. It is also about the form validation status. So I would suggest you cover those topics first, and then we will get back to the form resetting and I will show you how to do it properly. For now, we could do a temporary hack and just manually update our form model and reset values like that. So now if I go to the browser, modify some fields and click the save button, you can see that the values were reset. The last thing I would like to do is to clean up my view a little bit, because we can already see the form values and I don't need this printed user info anymore. So I'm going to remove it. Also, I want to remove ngForm options. I would like to have a default update on strategy, and the same I do for ngModel options. So I remove it and revert back the name for this ngModel. Like that. And now we are ready to move forward. Alright guys, I hope that even from this short, like relatively short but free version of the course, you could learn something new. And by the way, on my platform Decoded Frontend, there are more videos from this course available for free, so you can continue watching if you want. Just follow the link in the video description and enroll in the free version of the course. And as I said, if you are watching this video until November 11, 2022, you have a chance to get this course, I mean the full version of this course, for free. And this is what you have to do for that. So there are basically three very simple steps. The first one, the very important one, you have to leave comment under this video. Any comment, doesn't matter. The second step, you have to let me know if you like this video by hitting thumbs up or thumb down if you didn't like for whatever reason. And the last step, it is also very important, you have to share this video in any social media you like. So it can be Twitter, it can be LinkedIn, Instagram, you name it. And then on November 11th, there will be the live stream where I will pick at random 5 winners among those who left comment under this video. So don't forget to do that. And if you fulfill all the requirements, then you will be enrolled in this in the full version of this course for free. And this is basically it. I wish you good luck. Have a great week and see you on Friday stream.